The Oral History Criminology Project, in collaboration with the American Society of Criminology, is pleased to present to you a conversation with Terrie Moffitt. Although you've been going by Terrie?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So,
because Terrie Moffitt is also my father.
Okay.
so I do have another name.
We're here in Washington, D.C. at the National Academy of Sciences here in late May 2012, where you're taking part in the Committee on Law and Justice. And what kinds of things are being discussed here?
The Committee on Law and Justice is a committee within the National Academy of Sciences and the National Research Council that tries to enhance the flow of information for policymakers from science. And so we have to talk about what kinds of topics policymakers need more science on, and then try to stimulate that science by having seminars, panels, workshops, and consultation groups. So today we're talking about bullying, we're talking about terrorism, we're talking about child maltreatment, we're talking about the crime decline in America. So a variety of topics that could form workshops or panels.
Okay, all these things are germane in terms of public policy, in terms of perfect. Mm-hmm. You were born in Germany, and you retained dual citizenship at the UK, Great Britain, and the United States, and you also currently have academic appointments both domestically and abroad. Domestically, you are the, correct me if I stumble over this, the Knut Schmidt Nielsen Professor at Duke University, and you have a variety of appointments here in, I guess, 3 different departments: psychology and neuroscience, psychiatry and behavioral sciences, and the Institute of Genome Sciences and Policy. That's right. Wearing an awful lot of hats there.
I'd like to say that was because I was such a great multidisciplinary researcher, but I think it was that in a time when salary cutbacks, 3 departments had to go together in order to make a new hire.
That's interesting. You're also a professor of social behavior and development at the Institute of Psychiatry at the King's College in London. Here in the United States, you're no stranger to the Raleigh-Durham Chapel Hill area, having earned a BA in psychology in 1977 before heading out to the other end of the country there to pursue a PhD in clinical psychology at the University of Southern California in 1984. Within criminology, you've earned a couple of awards here that our viewers would certainly be interested in knowing about. You were inducted as an ASC Fellow in 2003, and you've earned the Stockholm Prize in 2007 as well, sort of an internationally kind of oriented recognition of your body of work. I should also mention that you were at the University of Wisconsin as well, correct?
That's right, as an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin.
Was that in the social or the psychology department?
Psychology. Department.
Okay.
Although while I was there, Ross Matsueda was a new assistant professor in the sociology department. So Ross and Karen Heimer and I used to meet weekly, and we had a seminar and a group who talked about crime and delinquency.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah. And that was during the era of the great controversy over the crime careers research. So Hershey and Godfredson were writing about that against crime careers research, and Al Bloomstein and Jackie Cohen were writing about for crime careers research. And so we had a seminar that met every Thursday night and had beer and discussed crime careers research.
That's really interesting.
1987, I think, 88, 89.
I want to come back to that at some later point, because I think that's really interesting in terms of the biography of some of your ideas. I think for the most part, most of criminology, and correct me if I'm wrong, would probably recognize you for either one of 2 things. The one would be the seminal document that became the developmental taxonomy in 1993, articulating this idea of life course persistent versus adolescent limited kind of offending patterns. And then there's a body of work that comes out of the Dunedin study. In 2001, your book, Sex Differences, co-authored Sex Differences in Antisocial Behavior, earned the Eleanor McCobie Book Award from the American Psychological Association. And there's a variety of different works that you've published within Criminology, our flagship journal, that resulted from that. But before the evolution of you as a scholar, you were just sort of, I guess at some point, just someone with a question. So what drew you, I guess the first question is, do you consider yourself a criminologist?
Oh, that's a great question. No one's ever had the temerity to ask me straight to my face. Yes, I do, and really privileged to be one too. I've worked in clinical psychology. I've worked in genetics. and I've worked in criminology and really a lot in psychiatry as well, in this field of mental health research. And I have to say that criminology is my favorite field because it's so open-minded and so Catholic in the best sense of that word, in that people come to criminology from all kinds of backgrounds, and it's a melting pot of ideas.
So what brought you from your formal training into sort of criminology per se?
When I was in graduate school, I was officially getting my PhD in clinical psychology, but I was based in the Social Science Research Institute, and that was a place that was
USC?
At the University of Southern California, and that was mainly a place that looked into crime. So Matt Klein was there, and he was a member of my PhD committee. So I was surrounded by criminologists from the very first days of graduate school.
Were you with Sarnoff Mednick?
Yes, Sarnoff was my PhD advisor from the psychology department. And he does research on schizophrenia on the one hand, but he also does research on crime.
Another name that comes to mind, Adrian Rain?
Adrian and I were sort of young researchers coming up together. His mentor was Peter Venables in Britain, because he went to the University of York, and my mentor was Sarnoff Mednick at the University of Southern California. And Peter and Sarnoff were best friends because they had worked together on the Mauritius longitudinal study, and had lots of wonderful trips into the South India Sea, looking into child development on the island of Mauritius.
Now, did you do a criminologically oriented dissertation, or were you following sort of Sarnoff's work on twin and adoption studies? Or
I used the Danish adoption data set, and the question I looked at for my dissertation was whether adoptees' violent behavior was more strongly related to their biological and adoptive parents' crime records, or their biological and adoptive parents' mental health records. So it's a bit of a different twist. Usually with an adoption study, you're looking to see whether the adoptees' outcomes are more similar to their biological parents, in which case you infer a genetic contribution, or if they're more similar to their adoptive parents' records, then you infer an environmental contribution. The tricky thing that had happened at the time was that it looked as though, from Sarnoff's original research, that the individuals in the Danish adoption study who had records of criminal offending, their records were more similar to their biological parents' records of criminal offending. So he made the inference that there was some kind of a genetic transmission of crime, but that wasn't applying to violent offending. So it was counterintuitive. Everyone thought, how could there be a genetic vulnerability to crime that doesn't in fact contribute to this specific kind of crime that we think of as the most serious? So my dissertation was asking, is a young person's violence actually more closely related to his biological or adoptive parents' mental health? And it was.
So is there any biographical reference point here in terms of you trying to figure out the nature versus nurture kind of question?
So how did I get interested in the genetics? I wasn't really interested in the genetics per se. I came to work with Sarnoff thinking, because I was a clinical psychology graduate student, that he would give me the topic of schizophrenia, because that was what he was most famous for. And what he did was he said, I've already got 12 graduate students working on dissertations on schizophrenia, and I'm getting bored with that. And we've got Lamar MP and Matt Klein and lots of criminologists here all around us. Let's draw them in and let's see what we can learn about crime using the same adoption design, because it was possible at that point to download crime records from the Scandinavian countries. So we really just took advantage of that opportunity to access some wonderful administrative databases, and the fact that the question had to do with comparing genetic versus environmental contribution, I think, was almost besides the point.
Now, is that what attracted you to longitudinal research as well?
What attracted me to longitudinal research was that I became compelled about the examples that I saw of how much better quality scientific inferences you could make if you looked prospectively at risk factors and followed people later. Right. Maybe I should explain what I mean by that. There were criminologists who were very influential in teaching me this. One was Marvin Wolfgang. So Sarnoff introduced me to Marvin. We went on a deep-sea fishing trip at a conference in Florida, and I got so seasick and was vomiting over the side of the boat, and Marvin was holding my head, and so that was my introduction to the great Marvin Wolfgang. He's a very compassionate person when you're sick. And Sarnoff also introduced me to Lee Robbins. And what was from Washington University of St. Louis. What you might not think Marvin Wolfgang and Lee Robbins would have much in common, but what they did have in common was that both of them believed passionately that you should start collecting data at the beginning of the life course and follow people forward. Because the alternative is to wait until people already have their outcome. They've become a violent offender, or they've become a person who's diagnosed with schizophrenia, and then ask them to recall back and about their childhood. And obviously their memories of their childhood are completely colored by what their outcome has been. So they pointed out that the only way to get unbiased information about someone's childhood is to start studying them then and follow them forward. So I really took that lesson on board as a young researcher.
I noticed that the Dunedin study had been going on prior to your completing your graduate degree. How did you become involved with that particular project, and what kinds of things were you able to introduce that made it the data set that it is?
It's
still ongoing, correct?
It's still ongoing, right? It's now funded by the National Institute of Aging, so it's becoming a gerontology study. That's a funny story too, how I got involved in the Dunedin study. It's not a very flattering story, but I will tell you it. And that is that, so there we were at the Social Science Research Institute at the University of Southern California, and Sarnoff received a visitor who came to stay for a few days, who was a visitor from New Zealand. His name was Phil Silva, and he was the director of the Dunedin study. And he was going around on an overseas study tour to get ideas for the Dunedin study, and really I think to talent scout to see if he could find young researchers from North America and Britain who might want to come there and do postdocs. So that's what I ultimately ended up doing. Now what makes the story unflattering is that just at about that time it was time for my dissertation defense. And several of us who were Sarnoff students at the time had our dissertation defenses coming up, and we were very anxious. And we reasoned that we should all go together and take parachute jumping lessons out in the desert, because if we could step out of an airplane at 3,000 feet, then our dissertation defense wouldn't seem nearly so scary relative to that. And so we did that, and several of us got injured. And I was broke my leg in several places, and was in a cast from my waist to my toe, and was in a wheelchair. So I was trapped and unable to get away from this visitor who came from New Zealand. And I had to sit and chat with him for hours on end and really entertain him. And during the course of that, because I had a broken leg, he managed to talk me into coming to New Zealand. So that's the part that's not so flattering. One of the other young researchers who did that was Kathy Van Dusen, and she went also on the parachute jumping, and she dislocated both of her shoulders. So I hit the ground spiraling like this and broke my legs, and Kathy spiraled like this and dislocated both of her shoulders.
You're giving your body for science on a couple of these different instances here.
There you go. Sarnoff was furious because it brought all the research to a halt for several months while we got better.
So when I look at your vita, I notice a broad spectrum of research interests, and giving a plug to your your website here, MoffittCaspi.com, MoffittCaspi.com, lists a couple of your research interests as antisocial and criminal behavior, depression, psychosis, and addiction. Your CV also lists the gene-environment interplay, as well as psychopathology and life course criminology. Now, do you see these as compartmentalized or different or discrete little elements, or are you thinking that these all cohere around maybe one or two organizing themes? Essentially, how would you characterize sort of your own research?
I think about this a lot. And there are different ways that you could respond to your question. So let's take the way that comes from the sort of substantive, scientific, theoretical point of view of why would I study both depression, substance abuse, alcohol, psychosis, crime. And the reason I think is that more often than not, those things tend to happen to the same people. So if you study one kind of mental health or behavioral outcome in isolation, you miss a lot that's important in a person's life. For example, we have seen in our longitudinal studies that the young people who develop schizophrenia often had antisocial behavior, delinquency, and conduct problems when they were adolescents, when their behavior was starting to become disorganized. So then it becomes an important question to look at the overlap between antisocial behavior and schizophrenia. We also then find that they have both antisocial behavior and schizophrenia in their family background, because women who have schizophrenia are very vulnerable and behaviorally disorganized, and who tends to have children with them might be more likely to be antisocial or psychopathic men who would take advantage of a woman in a vulnerable mental health state. So you can learn a lot more if you open yourself to study multiple forms of behavioral deviance. It's long been a bee in my bonnet that we have different funding agencies. So we have the National Institute of Justice to study crime over here, and the National Institute of Mental Health to study schizophrenia and depression, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse to study drugs, and the National Institute of Alcohol Abuse to study alcohol, when really a lot of us are studying the same individuals, and these factors are co-varying in their lives and contributing to their poor outcomes and to their cost to society. So it sounds trite to say, gee, we ought to all work together and have a more holistic view of human development, but I think that's the theoretical and substantive reason for doing research that way. Then there is a more cynical view, which I should also say, and that is that I never knew when I first started in a science career how important it was to become a small businessman. And you're constantly raising funds for your research because research costs money, and because you want to have young researchers work with you, and you need to have then studentships and postdoctoral fellowships to pay those young researchers. You need to have resources for the research team to work. And so research topics come and go in and out of fashion. Priorities of funding agencies change. Funding agencies may, veer away in one direction or another. If you have a study in which it's possible to submit a proposal about alcohol to the National Institute of Aging, and about drugs to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, and about schizophrenia or depression to the National Institute of Mental Health, and about domestic violence and crime to the National Institute of Justice, maybe one of those will pay off.
All right.
So for fundraising, it really, really helps to be eclectic and be able to study lots of different outcomes. A longitudinal study lends itself to that. Because once you have the study members involved and have their goodwill and they're willing to take part, you just as well collect data on more than one topic from them. And they appreciate that too, because it means that they see that you're taking them seriously as a person, and you're asking about all the things in their lives, not just one narrow thing. So I think it helps you raise money. It helps you retain the commitment and the goodwill of the participants in the research. and it helps you be truer to human development if you can study more than one kind of behavioral deviance in a career. The hard part is reading all those literatures.
So, if I'm reading you correctly, you don't necessarily differentiate criminology from all these different kinds of other adverse sort of life outcomes. Is there any hallmark or identifying characteristic of criminology as opposed to these other kinds of traditions, these other literatures that you're drawing from and are informed by?
Yeah, there are different ways in which there different biases in the journals from the different fields.
Okay.
There are different treatment systems and different social control systems and response systems.
Methodologies.
Yeah, different methodologies. For example, just to give one example, if you put forward the idea of studying genes and schizophrenia, everyone says, what a fantastic idea. Yes, let's do that. Mm-hmm. Here's some money.
Okay.
If you put forward the idea of studying genes in relation to violence, everyone says, not sure about that. This has a bad eugenics history. Let's don't go there.
Okay.
So there are different cultures.
Which brings me to a question that's kind of been burning in my mind. Legend has it that your 93 piece was rejected by our flagship journal, Criminology.
Yes, it was.
So could you give us some sort of indication as to why that might have been the case? Is it sort of a boundary drawing issue there in terms of this doesn't taste quite right to criminology?
That's interesting. I think the reason it's much less nefarious than that. I think it was just too damn long.
Oh,
so,
okay.
So the editor did offer me the opportunity to cut the paper by 2/3 and send it back, and I didn't want to do that.
Okay.
So I decided to opt for psychological review because it took longer pieces, and it's probably about that simple. Even though when the paper was entertained by the editor of Psychological Review, they did not want the sections on gender and race.
Okay.
So they made me cut those out.
Now, I'm wondering
which those are the two sections that have been of great interest to criminologists, interestingly.
How did that work its way or migrate into mainstream criminology? Most criminologists don't pick up psychological journals just for the fun of it.
Yeah. I'm not sure I know.
Yeah.
I was taking part at
Was it an immediate reaction like this is a celebrated piece, or was it more of a kind of a longer journey from?
The paper started being cited right away, and it started being cited by criminologists as well as developmental psychologists. It took longer to make its way into say social work and public health and those more kinds of applied fields, and eventually it made its way into pediatric medicine, so I see it cited in those kind of journals as well. But first off, it started with criminologists. That might be because I was involved at the time in the early 90s in the planning stages of the Chicago Program on Human Development in Chicago neighborhoods, and so Rob Sampson and I were getting together, and David Hausinga and Tony Earls, Richard Tremblay was part of that, and of course he's a developmental psychologist as well. But we were having a lot of meetings and discussions and talks about research ideas that ought to shape the design of that study. So it may be just the give and take with Rob Sampson that was important in getting people's attention to that article.
Now, getting back to the sort of your earlier story about being in that environment at the University of Wisconsin, when I look at some of the body of work and the timing of that body of work, in 1993 was sort of when criminology was in a really pitched battle between the Gofferson Hershey camp and the Sampson and Laub. And I correct me if I'm wrong, but the way I kind of interpret some of that work is that it manages to sort of make a peaceable compromise between those particular camps there. And I can see in a couple of pieces you expressly test some of the propositions that have been offered by these contending points of view. Is that Is that a fair or accurate characterization of why your work might have been particularly well-timed?
I think it was well-timed in the sense that I only had data up to age 18 at the time, and so I was really speculating wildly about what might happen beyond that, and it was really the crime careers research that opened the door. Opened people's thinking to linking adult criminal careers with juvenile onset of criminal careers. So in some ways I think it was the controversy over the crime careers, and also then bringing in the focus that Rob Sampson and John Laub had on the life course sociology, because it was really very parallel. There's a personal story about this, and that is that Rob and John were strongly influenced by Glenn Elders, a life course sociologist, who was the PhD advisor of my husband, Avshalom Caspi.
He was at UNC too, right?
Glenn is at UNC now, but he and Avshalom were at Cornell together in the Human Development School.
All right.
So when I met Avshalom, I was at the University of Wisconsin. He was at Harvard as an assistant professor. And John Laub was working at Radcliffe digging out the Gluck's data at that time. Rob and I were working on the program on human development in Chicago neighborhoods. And really the four of us used to get together and drink beer and talk about life course sociology and developmental psychology and how they were similar and different, and was this, old wine in new bottles, or could we draw on each other's ideas? Weren't they just the same thing? And so really Avshalom and Rob were very vigorously kind of going at each other, and I think John and I are sort of being more gentle and sweet by temperament, but we were all for taking part of that. So it was out of that stew of ideas about life course sociology and developmental psychology blending together that really we started thinking in that way, all four of us at the same time. And I remember it was the same summer in Boston when I came there to visit Avshalom, and Rob and John were there, and we spent a lot of time together.
That's incredible. Now, also in the backdrop here, I don't know if most mainstream criminologists are attentive or that wildly aware of this, was the bell carver wars actually unfolding at that particular point in time. And a lot of your work invokes that sort of third rail and incorporating ideas like IQ and biology. I'm just wondering, was there any controversy surrounding any of that, or you're offering some of those ideas as being legitimate, or how were you able to stay above the fray?
Staying above the fray was very important, and I found that the best way to stay above the fray was to have hard empirical data. So there was a lot of, I had students come to me at Wisconsin from the sociology department who said, I won't use the variable IQ in a model because I'm a sociologist. So there were these ideological stances that people were taking. I just had the training in clinical psychology, which requires 2 years in a hospital setting. And there I took care of patients who had head injuries and patients who had neurological conditions, like intractable epilepsy, early onset dementia. And what I saw in a lot of cases was when there was damage to the frontal lobes of the brain in these patients, that they became very disinhibited and rude, and they had poor impulse control. They would do things that their loved ones said were completely out of character for them. They would actually get in trouble with the law. And so this gave me the idea that there could be something at a brain level in children who get involved in antisocial behavior. I really got that from my clinical training. So bringing that in, I knew though from my clinical training that you had to actually measure this, collect the data carefully. And I knew from my criminology training that you better have darn good measures of the outcome variable, the crime variable. So this was something that Marvin Wolfgang and Matt Klein and Lee Robbins, just to go back to those influences, and Sarnoff Mednick were real sticklers about the importance of measuring crime well. Not just relying on official records, using self-reports. So this was in the era when people were talking about the need to study self-reported delinquency because it was the official crime was only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, it's hard to imagine today that was news, but it was news then. And the study by the self-report delinquency study by Delbert Elliott and David Hausinger was very new in showing that sometimes the correlates were different when you had self-reported delinquency. Matt Klein wrote a chapter called Watch Out for the Last Variable, meaning the dependent variable of crime, and he wrote that chapter because of his struggles in trying to teach me that lesson. And he said, "Oh, you psychologists are so dumb. You just take a piece of data and you take it at face value, and you don't really ask, why it was collected, what the measurement error is." And so he wrote this chapter really to me.
That's correct.
All about measuring delinquency.
I've heard that Mac is very direct. He's
Yes.
sort of legendary for has a renown for that.
Yeah, it was a great chapter. But likewise, you had to measure intelligence well, and you had to have the right sample with the right people in it. And if you did the research well, I found that it opened people's minds. They were willing to step away from their ideological stances and listen to hard, cold, empirical findings.
How have you seen criminology's acceptance or rejection of biology change over the course of the years, if at all?
It's changed a lot.
Was there some initial resistance, maybe?
I don't want to overblow both the initial resistance and the amount of change toward interest and acceptance in biology, because I think it's easy to do that, to over dramatize it, and I don't think that kind of revisionist view does anybody a service. When I first came into criminology and wanted to look at biological variables, the criminologists that I met there usually said, "You got to have the data. We're not interested in just assumptions. We want to see models." And then over the course of the years, when biological data have been brought on board and applied to the question of crime, and they haven't measured up, and the quality of the research has been inadequate and uncompelling, I think criminology has rightly stood back from it and said, "Okay, this is not enough, not good enough quality." When the data have reached a point of being really compelling, though, criminologists are generally very open-minded, and they've brought it in and weaved it into their theories and found really creative ways of embracing biology. Wayne Osgood had a paper in The Criminologist, a sort of an op-ed piece about stealing from our friends. I still love that piece. It was wonderful. And Wayne is he's
very eclectic too.
He's the quintessential model of the very open-minded criminologist who's willing who maintains skepticism about all data even-handedly, whether it comes from sociology or from psychology or from any field. He's skeptical about it, but once the proof is out there, he'll accept it, and then weave it into theory in the most elegant way. So. I've had a good experience with that. I wouldn't say at all, looking back over my career, that I've ever felt unfairly rejected by any person in the field of criminology. In the fields of genetics, yes. In the field of psychiatry, yes, but never from criminology.
Do you ever attempt to introduce criminologically oriented kinds of approaches or data into those other literatures? And then is that where can you tell us a little bit about where some of that resistance might be felt?
Let's see if I can think of an example.
Is criminology sort of relegated to sort of its own sphere?
Yeah, I think it is more. I have to confess. And part of that from the meeting that I've been in here this morning before you and I met There were presentations about child maltreatment, and there were presentations about children who were being victims of chronic bullying, and how this was affecting their mental health. And there was real there were real statements made about there's a certain public health way to study this that doesn't involve crime.
Yeah.
We don't want to criminalize these things, as if criminalizing something was inherently undesirable or immoral in some way. So my reaction was that, well, with or without us, these things are being criminalized.
When you look back at the body of work that you produced, are there any real contributions that you, at the end of your career, would look back on with a good deal of pride? What would those be, and why?
When I was thinking about that question, when you mentioned it, that it was going to come up, and I thought I could point to particular papers that I did that have been highly cited, or particular findings, but in fact I think that what I'm more proud of is having built the longitudinal databases that I've built. So I've spent a huge amount of my time and energy winning over the participants in the cohort studies that I do, to get them to take part, so that we keep a participation rate above 95%. So the Dunedin study started in 1972, and this year we just finished seeing the study members, and so there'll be almost 40 this year. The study, the environmental risk twin study in Britain, started in 1994. This year the young people will be seen at age 18. And in both of those studies we still have 96% of the people taking part after all these years. And so keeping the cohort intact, having the goodwill of the study members, building up the feeling of devotion and dedication between the research team and the research participants, creating that culture of trust and confidentiality is something that I'm really proud of. But also those databases are of great use to young researchers who would like to access them, because we have been very eclectic and collected lots of crime data, but also lots of biomarker data, and lots of mental health data, and lots of social and educational data, and lots of data on unemployment and social welfare benefits. And so the broad-ranging nature of those data sets I'm very proud of. So creating those scientific resources, I think of them as sort of like if you had something like a very complicated and expensive research tool that a lot of people will use, like a telescope or a supercomputer, collider, something like that. So a longitudinal cohort study is like that. It's an incredible tool.
Now, what kinds of structural limitations are there these days to creating these sort of long-lasting research enterprises?
One of the obvious ones that everyone's very anxious about is that modern people don't want to take part in research. So people are annoyed by all of the telephone calls that you get, and the surveys that you receive, and being hassled constantly by marketing, and people are less trusting of government and less trusting of scientists. And so there have been a lot of publications in the literature recently claiming that the typical recruitment rate is less than 50% in most new studies that are started. I know there's been an effort to start a national children's survey in the United States, and they've had real serious problems with recruitment and retention. So it looks like these older studies that we have there that started back in the 1970s are going to become increasingly valuable, because we may not be able to put together really good representative longitudinal cohorts anymore if we stay inside the United States. I understand that people are having greater success if they go to places like Brazil, Turkey, Korea. It's still possible to start a longitudinal cohort study there and build goodwill with the participants. So maybe cohort research will go more international.
Okay. How do you think the contributions that you've made over the course of your career have endured the criticism that they've encountered?
I'm a sort of conflict-averse person, and so I have, there's been two kinds of criticism that I've encountered, let's say most recently in the past 5 years. One, it has been in the area of behavior genetics, where I have published findings of gene-environment interaction, in which there are genotypes that appear to be associated with greater vulnerability or lesser vulnerability to social risk factors for behavioral outcomes. So one of those was looking at the serotonin transporter genotype. People who had the short form of it were more vulnerable to become depressed after stressful life events. And then there's the study with the MAOA genotype. People who had the low activity form of it were more vulnerable to develop antisocial behavior themselves if they were victims of child maltreatment. So these two papers came out in 2002, 2003, and the important thing in genetics is replication, because the possibility of chance findings is so high in that field. So people immediately set about to replicate those papers. What has happened over the course of the last 10 years is that there have been almost 20 studies repeating the MAOA design, and there have been 60 studies repeating the serotonin transporter design. And in both cases, about half of the studies have got a positive replication of those findings, and about half have a negative replication of those findings. There have been some meta-analyses that have said, oh, this, half full, half empty. They've said, oh, this is half empty. These findings can't be right unless everyone can replicate them. Then there have been meta-analyses who have pointed out, gee, it's a miracle that any of the studies replicated, and what's the chance that out of 60 papers, 30 of them would get exactly the same finding? So I've really watched that, you might call it criticism. I think it's more like the healthy progress of science, and I wish more social science was orientated towards replication testing, in fact. But that's been a healthy process. We've learned an awful lot. I've had my feelings hurt on occasions and been quite downcast and depressed after a negative meta-analysis would come out, but then you get unduly happy and thrilled when a positive meta-analysis comes out right after it. So now we're in the stage of the dueling meta-analyses. Overall, I don't feel criticized in the end of it all. I feel like I've had this royal opportunity to learn something that I never could have learned all by myself in my one little program of research. And I'm hugely flattered that other people thought these papers were so interesting that they did research on the same topic. I mean, that's kind of amazing to me. So that was one area. The other area, which is more directly in the heart of criminology, is on the question of whether life course persistent offenders who start in childhood with childhood aggression and then carry on developing a variety of different kinds of offenses as adolescents and continue to offend in adulthood, how long do they offend? So this again has become controversial, mainly because my dear friends Rob and John had a data set from the Glucks that they could go back and ask, how long do these supposedly life course persistent offenders continue to offend? Is life course persistent a misnomer? Do they have the same potential for reform and turning their lives around as any other ordinary person? And so in their book they argued yes, and suggested that it was going too far to use the life course persistent phraseology, I suppose. I think when I was originally writing about them, I was not assuming that they were going to continue offending at such a high rate right until they were 90 years old, walking with a cane and dropped over the edge of the grave. But I didn't clarify that, and so fair enough. I left the implication in my writing. I was imprecise, and I left the implication that was the expectation. So I'm grateful to Rob and John for clarifying that. And again, I see it as kind of the healthy process of science. People came to me and said, "Oh, you must write a rebuttal."
Yeah.
And I said, "I don't think I can write a rebuttal because I think they're probably correct." So, and they're more articulate than me about this. Since that time, other people have published studies saying that if you look at certain types of crime, you can find offenders still going into old age. I think we found that in David Farrington's Cambridge longitudinal study that the men followed up until their 50s were engaging in some domestic violence, if perhaps easier victims at older ages. So again, I'm just hugely grateful that something that I wrote was interesting enough to other people that they thought it was worth doing some research on it. And if they had done the research and said, in a sort of platitudinous way, "Oh yes, this is absolutely right," that would have been the end of it, and my citation count would be very low. So the fact that the data have been ambiguous, that you can interpret them different ways, that there are findings that seem to suggest that the taxonomy needs revising, keeps it alive. So it's kind of bizarre and beautiful and wonderful to me that here we are 20 years on and people are still doing papers on this. So I think that's really great. So can I, after going on at such great length, can I just sort of reframe your question about, rather than being how have I felt about being criticized, to say, how amazing is it that these controversies continue until today, and how great that says our scientific enterprise.
I think it suggests something about the vigor of the discussion, and the rigor of the discussion that's taking place here. And in a way, I guess I can appreciate that being sort of an honor in a way.
It is,
because it was able to propel discussion in a very real and meaningful way. And I think it's in many ways it did address a very fundamental question that criminology was just revolving around at that particular point in time, and its development there in terms of which one is it? Well, it might be a little bit of both here.
Yes, exactly. If you think what's the counterfactual to being criticized? The counterfactual is the thing that all of us have the worst horror when we start off in a social science career, is that no one will read our papers. That will work really hard on them and no one will care. And so to the extent that has not happened to me, there's been an angel on my shoulder.
Now, if you were giving advice to somebody of my generation, or maybe even a generation younger, in terms of what you need to do to accomplish something in this field, what kinds of pieces of advice would you be proffering?
Oh, you could get
is there maybe anything that you might think back on and that I wish I would have done that differently, or my career would look differently if I would have taken this path versus this other path?
I think I spread myself too thin.
Okay.
So many things interested me, but you could go back and say that I would have been a better criminologist if I had really focused more. My work could have made a bigger impact if I had been able to really attend ASC every year and give a symposium and nurture it. So to a certain extent, I think I made a terrible mistake just putting a paper out there and then going to work on a different topic the next 5 years. So I would encourage young people to really delve into something and become an expert in it, and stick with it and see it through, and really become known for expertise, so that when people need a person who does X or Y or Z, they think of you. Your image and your public reputation is associated with an area of expertise or an area of inquiry. We're all encouraged so much these days to publish fast and get lots of grants. And almost the only way that you can do that is to skip about data set to data set in an opportunistic way, grab to different questions just based on what data are there.
Yeah.
But I don't think that makes for an intellectually satisfying career. And in the end, you get known as a person who's good with data rather than a person who has their own
ideas, I guess.
Theme of ideas.
All right.
Right. So it's easy for me to say, oh, choose a meaty topic, delve into it, stick with it, when your department chair is saying to you, publish lots of different papers, use lots of different data sets, get lots of different grants. So I fully realize that my advice might not be something that's easy for young people to follow. But if there's a trend that you could sort of try to have a resisting force, it's don't let yourself get spread too thin.
Now, is your stature vary by the different hats that you wear when, for instance, when you're at Duke and you've got these 3 different appointments?
I think I'm very well known in child mental health. I'm somewhat well known in criminology because of the developmental criminology took off just at the time I wanted to do it. I'm considered a crap geneticist, so most people in the field of genetics would.
Is that because genetics has a very, parochial view of social sciences as being sort of a stepchild
soft.
kind of thing?
Soft.
Okay.
And who is she that she has the cheek as a psychologist, not even a proper molecular biologist? Who is she to try to use genes?
We're stealing their variables in many ways.
A little bit, yeah. But also they're mainly interested in doing scanning the whole genome to try to make discoveries of new disease genes. And my work could be interpreted to say that, there are a lot of important genes that are not going to be found in that way because they depend upon each person's unique environmental context. And just by scanning huge populations, you'll never find them unless you take environmental context into account. Yeah. And the reason I'm disliked for that by geneticists is they haven't collected any social science data.
Yeah.
So if I'm right, they're in trouble. And that would be an unhappy moment for them. So time will tell.
Okay. Do you have any general thoughts on the sort of the state of intellectual vitality within the field? I think you have a unique perspective largely because you go to other conferences and you wear all these other hats in terms of getting an accurate assessment of where criminology stands in terms of its social scientific brethren here.
I think I started out this session by saying how I found criminology the most open-minded field. I also find it the most well-mannered, almost courtly.
Wow.
People are almost always very polite to each other. There is the cut and thrust of competition of ideas and honing ideas against each other. But people who are attracted to criminology, who are attracted to the problem of crime, are really, really smart, but somehow they're not mean.
Yeah.
I'm not sure how to say this. Perhaps it's because what our greatest tools that we work with in criminology are our brains. We don't really work, there's a problem I have with geneticists is that they work with a lot of machines and tissues, and they have these physical kinds of technologies that they rely on. And so they somehow are less personable, less friendly, less interested in each other's minds. They're interested in their machines. And so I find them boring. It's like talking to plumbers and electricians, and they're engineers, really. It's not an intellectually satisfying field for me. So I have much more fun going to a criminology meeting than going to a genetics meeting. Criminology is a really remarkable field.
Are we respected in these other approaches?
I think people in the other approaches Well, put it this way: in people who are working in the more sort of technical, hard biology fields, they've often chosen their problems because they tell me they see them as being something that is solvable within 10 years.
Okay.
They look at criminology and they see us as working on something, a social problem that has been here ever since Cain slew Abel.
All right.
And it's probably still going to be with us. I laugh and say to them, I would not want to spend my field studying something I thought, a problem that could be solved in 10 years, because then I would have to go back to graduate school again and learn a new field. And how stressful would that be? But crime is almost, they see us as almost philosophical.
Yeah.
We're doing science, but we're grappling with the sort of moral mainsprings of humanity, or something lofty like that. So I think in some ways they admire the intellect and the intellectual curiosity of the criminologist, thinking of us as being sort of big thinkers or somehow, and it's true, criminologists are big thinkers.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Now, when you think about the future of criminology, what do you think it's maturing into, or what is it developing into? Is it going towards this sort of unified approach that you're talking about, and sort of just conceptualizing crime as part of a constellation of just negative or adverse sort of life outcomes?
Well, one of the trends that criminology is engaging in a very positive way, I think, is the move toward more experimental criminology and more this awkward word of translational, but to try to hold the basic blue sky scientists among us, hold our feet to the fire to say, can justice policy really use this to improve the lives of victims and offenders? Our quest is to understand and control crime. It's all very well, those of us who just like understanding, but we really do have to pay attention to the control side. So this was one of the reasons that I think the Stockholm Prize in Criminology was developed, was to try to reward people and make a public statement that criminology is making an applied difference, that it's moving in a direction to be less of a philosophical, kind of almost literary science, and moving more toward the direction of generating evidence for policy and practice. So we don't want to go so far in that direction that we lose our big ideas or our open minds, because one of the things that when you're focusing on what to do in an applied way is you tend to not think very broadly theoretically. So criminology has this wonderful culture of valuing theory and basic science, and it's starting to move in a direction of being more experimental and more applied and translational. I think that's a nice marriage. So it's a good trend. Criminology is really a remarkable field.
Are we respected in these other approaches?
I think people in the other approaches, well, put it this way: in people who are working in the more sort of technical, hard biology fields, they've often chosen their problems because they tell me they see them as being something that is solvable within 10 years.
Okay.
They look at criminology and they see us as working on something, a social problem that has been here ever since Cain slew Abel. And it's probably still going to be with us. I laugh and say to them, I would not want to spend my field studying something I thought, a problem that could be solved in 10 years, because then I would have to go back to graduate school again and learn a new field. And how stressful would that be? But crime is almost, they see us as almost philosophical. We're doing science, but we're grappling with the sort of moral mainsprings of humanity, or something lofty like that. So I think in some ways they admire the intellect and the intellectual curiosity of the criminologist, thinking of us as being sort of big thinkers or somehow, and it's true, criminologists are big thinkers. So,
Now, when you think about the future of criminology, what do you think it's maturing into, or what is it developing into? Is it going towards this sort of unified approach that you're talking about, and sort of just conceptualizing crime as part of a constellation of just negative or adverse sort of life outcomes?
Well, one of the trends that criminology is engaging in in a very positive way, I think, is the move toward more experimental criminology and and more this awkward word of translational, but to try to hold the basic blue sky scientists among us, hold our feet to the fire to say, can justice policy really use this to improve the lives of victims and offenders? You know, our quest is to understand and control crime. It's all very well, those of us who just like understanding, but we really do have to pay attention to the control side. So this was one of the reasons that I think the Stockholm Prize in Criminology was developed, was to try to reward people and make a public statement that criminology is making an applied difference, that it's moving in a direction to be less of a philosophical, kind of almost literary science, and moving more toward the direction of generating evidence for policy and practice. So we don't want to go so far in that direction that we lose our big ideas or our open minds, because one of the things that when you're focusing on what to do in an applied way is you tend to not think very broadly theoretically. So criminology has this wonderful culture of valuing theory and basic science, and it's starting to move in a direction of being more experimental and more applied and translational. I think that's a nice marriage. So it's a good trend.